Hey everyone, Tactics here, continuing my Season 2 Mythic Plus Guide series by diving into one of the Dragonflight dungeons, NELTHARUS. I'll be covering things like important interrupts, abilities that you want to stop or avoid, boss mechanics and strategies, and much more. I'll also be walking you through a pug-friendly route in MDT, and I'll link that down in the description as well if you want to import it for yourself. On top of all of my Mythic Plus guides that I'm putting out, which you can find linked in the description again or over on my channel, I'm also going to be creating advanced guides for every single Season 2 dungeon, and those are just going to go through various tips and tricks to help you time all of these dungeons on higher key levels. So if that sounds like something that you're interested in seeing, make sure you do subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Otherwise, let's get into the dungeon itself, and right off the bat, you are faced with a choice of two different wings, left towards Magmatusk or right towards Chargath and Forgemaster. So let's just assume off the top here, we're going to go left. Initially, you have two Kalashi Wardens right at the front of the dungeon. These guys have a frontal in Volcanic Guard. This targets the tank and it does not follow them, so literally everyone can avoid them. They also just have a fire tank hit in Blazing Flash. Notably, these guys are lieutenant mobs, so you cannot stop either of those abilities, but it's not too scary either way. Just make sure you avoid that frontal. Kalashi's Spine Crushers are also in this wing. They also just have a single tank buster ability, but this one is physical damage. It's called Brutal Strike. It's stoppable, but really not a high priority because it's not too dangerous for your tank. In this area are a bunch of ore elementals. These guys have a single ability as well in Granite Shell. It just puts up a magical absorb shield on themselves, so you can purge that off, but they can become dangerous from the Kalashi Thaumaturges that are in this area. These guys have an interruptible cast called Molten Core, and basically this will transform a nearby ore elemental into a molten elemental, and these guys deal pulsing fire damage to anyone within 50 yards every 3 seconds, so you really high priority want to kick this ability. Thaumaturges also have a stoppable cast and magma conflagration. This is a random target fire damage attack against a single player. Also going to do a ton of damage on higher fortified keys, so you will want to commit a stop to this, especially over Brutal Strike, which is really your only other option in this area. Kalashi Plunderers are the last relevant mob that you're going to face on your way to the boss in this area. They also just have a single spell, an Explosive Concoction. This throws a 7-yard swirly at a random player. You can just step out of it. It is stoppable, like some of the other spells here, but similar to Brutal Strike, not really a high priority. Focus all those stops on Magma Conflagration. Making your way upstairs on the left half of the dungeon, you'll find Magmatusk's room, which is a simple but difficult boss fight, maybe one of the harder ones at the beginning of the season so far based on PTR. You'll notice that the boss does start with 2 stacks of a Magma Tentacle buff, and this empowers his different abilities, so let's talk about them. Starting with Lava Spray, it's a frontal cone, and this is targets on a random player, not the tank, and this does follow that same random player, so they specifically can't avoid it, so the goal here is just making sure that you don't strafe over any other party members with it. The damage of this ability is increased by 100% per stack of Magma Tentacle, so this gets more dangerous as the fight goes on. On top of this, there's also swirlies to dodge in Magma Lob. There's just a 4-yard AoE aimed at random players, and this leaves behind a puddle when it touches the ground, and if Magmatusk is ever inside any of these puddles, he becomes empowered, getting 25% increased damage, so you want to make sure you avoid them. Help make avoiding puddles more interesting, let's say, the boss will sometimes use Blazing Charge at a random player. This deals fire damage and knocks back anyone hit. Unlike the cone, it does not follow, so even the targeted player can avoid it, and then once the charge is done, it shoots out lava waves, where the number of waves shot out increases based on these Magma Tentacle stacks. Finally, at 100 energy, Magmatusk uses Volatile Mutation. This deals an initial fire hit to the entire party, and then a dot that ticks once every 5 seconds per stack of Magma Tentacle. On top of this, this cast also increases the boss's Magma Tentacle stacks by 1, though note that the boss is capped at 5 total stacks, so it doesn't infinitely scale up the longer the fight goes on, but it still ramps up in difficulty a fair bit. This boss basically just repeats from here, but as I mentioned, this is a very difficult boss fight, at least on the PTR, and if it doesn't get nerfs, this is probably one of the harder boss fights in Season 2, so you will probably want to commit your Bloodlust on this boss. Skipping across to the opposite side of the dungeon, there's some Kalashi Hunters and their Phoenixes. Phoenixes don't really do much here. The Hunters have a couple different abilities. The first is Binding Spear. This throws a small swirly at a random player, and if they get hit by it, this deals physical damage, but more importantly, pins them for 10 seconds. Very punishing if you are hit by this, so make sure you avoid these swirlies on the ground. They also have Bold Ambush. This is just a charge attack at a ranged player usually, and it puts a small 3-second bleed on players. This one doesn't seem too dangerous, though it could maybe be similar to Noku Defensive, where those bleeds get really scary on high fortified keys. Something to note about the trash here on the right side of the dungeon is that mixed in, you will find interactable chains that once a player clicks on them, they'll get a chain attached to them, which slows them. But if you ever run these through some trash mobs, it'll explode, dealing damage both to yourself and the trash as well. This hit is quite hefty, so it's a big damage increase if you're able to use them, but of course it also hits the player using it, so be careful in that sense. You may need to pop a defensive, and note that you can't interact with these chains more than once per 5 minutes, but potentially interesting tech here to use, maybe discovered later on in the season, but just something to note. There's also a mini boss very early on in this wing in Overseer Lahar. This guy's got imbued magma as a passive and just makes his melees have a 50% chance to deal additional fire damage and apply a 12-second dot to your tank, so be aware tanks are probably going to take a decent amount of damage when you pull this mini boss. On top of that, he has a 10-yard AoE fire hit in Burning Roar. This is interruptible, and I recommend kicking it because there's not too much else in this area you want to kick, so make sure you're kicking that. Otherwise, it also does that knockback on top of that AoE damage if you stay inside of it. Finally, this mob will use Eruptive Crush. This is just a 6-yard swirly on the tank that deals fire damage, and then it'll explode into multiple different smaller swirlies all over the place. Everyone just wants to make sure to avoid this. In terms of other mobs in this area, there's the Kalashi Trainee. These guys have a frontal in Magma Fist, also tank targeted, that does not follow, very similar to early on. Though this one is not just a single hit, this is a channel, so you can stop this mob luckily. Again, unlike the one at the beginning this time, those guys were lieutenant mobs, trainees are not, so you can stop this or you can just move out of the way. They also have a self-enrage and fired up. Again, stoppable if you want to, or soothable because it is an enrage effect, and this just gives them 50% haste. Bone Tenders, also in this area, they have a random target physical hit in Bone Toss. This one actually kind of chunked a little bit, so maybe stop this if you can, because again, it is stoppable and the mob is not a lieutenant. They have a heal as well in Mending Clay. This is a channeled heal onto a random mob, so interrupt this if you can, stop it as well, both will work. At the end of the hallway on the lower floor here, you'll enter a small arena with the next boss, Chargath, Bane of Scales, who, just like Magmatusk, has a Magma Wave ability, so this one is just fired out at a random player, but still make sure you avoid it. In terms of random damage here, there's Dragon Strike, which has the boss jump to a random player after a delay, dealing physical damage to them and applying a 14-second long bleed for good measure, so they'll just need a little bit of healing love. Chargath has a chain ability as well. Similar to what we discussed earlier on in the trash area, he marks 3 players with Grounding Spear, which after a short delay fall to the ground, dealing physical damage to them and spawning puddles around the spears themselves that you want to avoid. And this also tethers the targeted players to their respective spear, slowing them by 40% in the process. Shortly after throwing these spears out, the boss will begin channeling Fiery Focus for 25 seconds, dealing damage to all players and shooting out lava splashes constantly every second that you need to avoid. To end this channel early, all 3 chained players need to run their chain through the boss, which will stun him for 12 seconds once you've done so, and cause him to take 50% increased damage for the duration. Note that each time a player breaks their chain on Chargath, the entire party will gain a stacking 4-second dot in Slag Eruption, which also comes with a pretty hefty initial hit, so be careful that you don't break all your chains around the same time, or maybe do and just commit some big defensives. Once you defeat Chargath, a nearby door will open up and you'll be able to fight your way upstairs towards the Forgemaster. Some similar Kalashi mobs that you faced on the right side are here, but there's some new ones upstairs, including Kalashi Lava Bearers. These guys just will occasionally spawn lava puddles around them from their auto attacks thanks to their lava drip buff, and if that's not enough lava, then they will also sometimes throw lava at random players, which is just a swirly that you need to avoid. None of these are stoppable because this is a lieutenant mob. Often though, they are joined by lava flares. These guys are much smaller, lower health mobs, and these just have a single spammable cast in Melt. It's just a random target fire hit, and you can interrupt this, not stoppable, it's just a spam cast, so you want to kick these as much as possible. Other mobs in this area include Kalashi Iron Torches. These guys have a Scorching Breath frontal. This is actually a random target frontal instead of a tank targeted one. It is channeled again, and it does not follow the target, so you can just move out of it, or again, you can stop it because these are not lieutenant mobs. Mode of Combustion is a pretty high priority kick or stop here. This is a tank targeted magic dot that they have put out, and it'll do a 50-yard explosion after 6 seconds. So really want to make sure that this never goes out. Kalashi Bone Splitters are in this area as well. They have a couple stoppable only abilities. The first is Pierce Marrow. This is a random target charge, attack, and physical hit. It's not actually too scary. The more scary one is actually the next one, Dragon Bane Axe, which is a random target physical hit with 10-second bleed. So if you have to choose between the two, I'd recommend stopping that one. The Iron Torch Commander mini-boss is in this area as well. This guy's got a couple abilities. First is Scorching Fusillade. This is a 6-yard AoE around every single player that will deal fire damage after a delay. So you just want to make sure that you're not all stacked on top of each other. And then outside of that, there's Conflagrant Battery, which just spawns a bunch of 3-yard swirlies everywhere that you need to dodge. The Kalashi Blacksmith is closer towards the boss. This guy's got a Forge Stomp AoE. This is just a 40-yard fire hit that you'll need to heal through because these guys are, of course, not CCable. Outside of that, they have a pretty nasty tank hit as well in Reverberating Slam. It's a physical hit, but it has a pretty nasty 9-second dot attached to it, so tanks beware, this dot does hurt. Forge Rot Monstrosities are the last mob in this area, and they have a pretty simple ability, Forge Rot Fury. This is just pulsing fire damage every 2 seconds. Honestly, you probably want to avoid these mobs. They're a lieutenant mob, they're very healthy, and they end up pumping out a lot of consistent damage to your entire party while they're alive. I recommend avoiding these guys if possible. Working away on his anvil in this upper area, you'll find Forgemaster Gorek, who actually uses his anvil in a combo called Might of the Forge, initially dealing pulsing fire damage with his hammer, followed by him marking 3 different players that he throws his Aegis between, which deals fire damage to them and then anyone within 4 yards of them, and then causes blazing eruptions to shoot out from those players that you want to avoid. Note that the direction that these swirlies actually shoot out is based on where the targeted players are facing, so in theory you could line them up in a more coordinated group, of course, and if you all face the same direction in a line, you'll never hit each other with these swirlies. For tanks, there's Heated Swings, another combo where the first hit deals physical damage, knocks the tank back, and then is followed by the boss leaping to the tank's new location and dealing a lethal mix of fire and physical damage standing within 8 yards of that impact, and then leaving behind also a puddle of forge fire, so you really want to make sure everyone, including the tank, avoids this impact. Outside of that, the boss will occasionally throw his hammer into the forge, igniting a forge storm, which is just a constant barrage of swirlies that you'll want to avoid, and note that this does tend to overlap with the beginning of that Might of the Forge combo, otherwise this fight just kind of repeats from here. Once you've defeated all 3 of the wing bosses on the outside of the dungeon, Warlord Sargha's area will open up in the center, and there are a few more new trash mobs here. All of them are lieutenant mobs, so they're not CCable. The first is Apex Blazewing. These guys have a single cast Incandescent Tempest, which just deals channeled fire damage to the entire group, as well as pushes players back, so be careful with that. Finally, there's the Kalashi Lavamancers. These guys have a spammable fire tank hit in Lava Bolt that you can interrupt. Then they'll also occasionally throw up a Magma Barrier on themselves, which is an Absorb Shield that will deal a 50-yard AoE hit when they're destroyed. And normally, right after that Molten Barrier goes up, they also start casting Molten Army, which is just an interruptible cast that just summons a bunch of small lava spawn mobs, so you want to kick that whenever you can. Again though, important to note, the dangerous part here is when that Molten Barrier bursts. That's when the big damage is coming, so be aware of that. Once you've cleared this area, you'll be able to fight the Warlord herself, surrounded by her massive treasure hoard. Continuing the frontal theme, she does aim a cone at a random player in the Dragon's Kiln, so just make sure you step out of this as it does not follow the target. Molten Gold is a pretty nasty dot that she puts out on a single player. This ticks every 3 seconds for 18 seconds, so make sure they do get some extra healing during this dot. Finish off her regular phase, she'll sometimes summon a Burning Ember at a random location. This deals damage to players within 7 yards of the impact, and then leaves behind a puddle and summons a Raging Ember ad, which will fixate a random player. These mobs are fully CCable, so while you can opt to cleave them down with the boss, you can also just keep them hard CC'd and just ignore them entirely. At full energy, Sargha will put up a massive Magma Shield on herself. This deals pulsing fire damage every 3 seconds for the 45-second duration, and each tick will also apply Flame Vulnerability to all players, increasing the damage they take from this ticking damage by 50% per stack. At the same time, lava is constantly erupting as 8-yard swirlies that you want to avoid. In order to break through the shield, you'll want to use her treasure hoard against her. You may have noticed since the start of the fight there are interactable objects that spawn throughout the boss arena, and this will give you one of 5 potential weapons when picked up. They all do slightly different things, but the gist is they each do massive damage to absorb shields. You want to pick them up early on as soon as you can, and then as soon as that magma shield goes up, you want to use them ASAP to try and get out of this phase as quickly as possible. One caveat to remember is that picking up one of these treasures applies Curse of the Dragon Horde to the player. This is 5 minutes long, and it's a curse that deals ticking damage every 3 seconds for that duration and stops you from picking up another weapon. So it's pretty important to bring a curse dispel to this dungeon, as it'll just make this boss fight way easier if you can just start removing these curses ASAP as soon as people get them. Otherwise here the boss will just rotate between her phase where you're fighting her and the phase where she's just channeling inside of a magma shield. With the dungeon talk done, let's look at a simple, easy to execute pug route here in MDT, and I'll link that down in the description as well for anyone interested. As a disclaimer, the goal of this route is to not be the most optimal best thing you can do, but instead be something that's more accessible for players of all skill levels, especially pug groups early on in the season, which means I'm avoiding things like massive, high coordination pulls, and even things like skips. Feel free though to adjust it to your needs here, but let's go through it here. Off the bat, got a decently sized pull over on the right side. The thing to remember here though, ore elementals, very low HP. There's 3 of them in this pull, 4 of them actually. So they kind of something that makes these pulls look very inflated. So there's a lot of low health mobs here. They look very inflated. Don't worry, I'll walk you through them all. 2 frontals here in the warden, so be careful of them. 2 spine crushers, which are just tank damage and do nothing else. And then eventually this patrol will come in and you have the priority target in the thaumaturge for kicks and stops. Nothing else in this pull really matters besides the 2 frontals. Same deal over here. This is all these plunderer guys. They throw the things you need to dodge, so just avoid that, and that's literally all they do. Then you have 2 thaumaturges who don't do their kick if there's no ore elemental in the pack, so instead they just have the stop. You want to make sure you do avoid this 3-pack of elementals, otherwise you will have to deal with 2 kicks and 2 stops in this pack. So just pull them back to the front of the room here, but otherwise just pull these ore elementals who don't really do much into this next pack over here, which has some more ore elementals, and then basically just 1 mob in the thaumaturge. So this area seems like big pulls over here, but you have to remember these ores will do nothing. Really the only mob that's relevant in this area are the thaumaturges and then the 2 wardens in the very first pull. So much bigger than they would actually appear. Then you've got Magmatusk. You can jump down here. This pack is not here when you jump down initially, so you can just run across and go to the first pull here. Look, this pull looks massive. Like 7 of these mobs are phoenixes that like do nothing, so there's really only 2 hunters. Similarly in here, you've got 3 phoenixes, 1 hunter, and then the mini boss who patrols all the way up here over this way. So that's why he's all the way down here in MDT, but he patrols all the way up here. So pull that with the mini boss. Same deal. Another pull that looks kind of big. You've got a couple phoenixes that don't really do much. You've got 3 trainees who are just frontal cones that you can stop this time, unlike the wardens, which you can't stop. And you've got a hunter, which doesn't really do much, and then 1 bone tender, which has 1 kick. So again, pull that looks very big, but is not actually that big. 1 kick in the entire pull. Maybe it's intimidating looking, but trust me, it's not too bad. Just 1 kick to be aware of. Similarly, pull right before the boss. This has 2 hunters, a trainee, and a bone tender. Again, 1 kick. Then you've got the boss here. These packs aren't connected. These 3 are right here. So again, hunter, trainee, bone tender, bone tender. So there are 2 bone tenders in this pack. This guy's way over to the side, very easy to avoid. Similarly, this guy's way over to the side sleeping, so you can actually just walk here. Pull this pack to the bottom of the stairs, which again, this pack looks pretty big. It's 5 phoenixes, so don't worry about it. You then move upstairs this way, and you've got a pull here, which you can LOS around this corner. The lava flares are a little bit more difficult, but luckily this lava bearer itself doesn't do too much. You just have to worry about the iron torch a little bit with the frontal and stuff. So keep kicks on as many lava flares as you can, but again, their HP is very low, so they'll die pretty quickly. Similarly, just 1 pull over here, and then you've got the mini boss Iron Commander. I do recommend trying to pull these 2 lava bearers over here. They have true sight, and this is how you get out of this area. So otherwise, you have to just do this 2-pack on its own, or find another way around it with like a combat drop, something like that. But in a pug group, I'd actually kind of recommend just dragging these lava bearers, assuming your tank is okay with it and can survive, right on top of this commander, because there's not really too much else to do, and it's just good value. You get to do 3 targets instead of a 1 target and a 2 target pull. So I think that's pretty worth. Then you move up here, you've got the lava flares, which can be difficult. You can separate this pull if you're not too comfortable, because the lava flares hitting people in combo with the blacksmith here doing the party damage can be a bit of a pain. So if you want to just do these 4 lava flares, for example, you could do 2 of them even with this commander again, and then you could do 2 of them with the 3-pack here. That's something you could totally do, so just keep that in mind. Then you move forward here, a bone splitter and a lava bearer again who doesn't do much, 2 guys, and then you can jump down. Those monstrosities I talked about avoiding here because they're very, very healthy and they have that constant party damage. Patrol this area. I recommend avoiding both of them here and just jumping down, killing the 2 trash packs near the boss and just using this entire circle, and then you can just wait for a good pat on this side here to run back up the stairs and then head out towards the last boss. And now this trash pack will have spawned. 3-pack here. I pulled the 2 together, but again, similarly, you can have this pull. You can do a 2-pack here if you really want to, followed by a 3-pack. There is a, Lavamancer there. And I believe that's the only one. There might be a second here, but even then, it would only be 2 kicks there that you really need to focus on in the army cast. I think it is 2. Maybe MDT is wrong here. But either way, all these mobs are lieutenant mobs, so you can't stop anything. Just be careful in that sense, but it's not too dangerous in terms of the kicks going out. The real dangerous stuff is the damage, right? You've got the Blaze Wing doing the pulsing damage, the frontals, which you'll want to try and avoid, but obviously the pushback is going on, so be careful. And then, of course, the Lavamancer's Molten Shield when it bursts is also quite scary. And then that brings you to the last boss. That is it for this dungeon, guys. Hopefully this video helped you out. If it did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more content like it, including some advanced routing videos coming shortly into the season, and even things like tank spec and raid boss guides. If you have any questions about this dungeon, feel free to drop them down in the comments below, or come ask me over on my Twitch channel at Tactics, where I stream high mythic plus keys and mythic raiding from a tank POV. As always, thank you to all of my supporters over on Patreon. It really does mean a lot, and I'll see everyone in the next video.